Hello. Throughout our developmental psychology course, I'm going to do some brief lectures on various topics. And today I would like to talk about developmental theories. I've selected three important theories for us to consider today: Freud's psychosexual theory, Erikson's psychosocial theory, and Piaget's cognitive theory. These are all important theories of development that help us to look at development from three different perspectives, or look through three different lenses to better understand some aspects of development. As you learn about developmental theories in your reading, you'll come to appreciate that some developmental theories are considered to be continuous and others discontinuous. A continuous developmental theory is one that suggests development occurs gradually over time in a non-stepwise manner, whereas discontinuous theories of development suggest that development progresses in a more stepwise way. So if you encounter a theory that has stages in it, you're most likely looking at a discontinuous theory, and all three of the theories that we are going to be talking about today are stage theories, so they would be considered to be discontinuous theories. Sigmund Freud is a fascinating person and one who has contributed greatly to not only the field of psychology but other fields as well. Many of his ideas were and are controversial, but some of his ideas have stood the test of time and have made a significant contribution to our understanding of human nature in general and human development more specifically. As you may already know, Freud lived in Vienna, Austria, and at the time of the Nazi occupation, he left and eventually ended up in London, and did visit the United States before he died, I believe around 1938, when he was in his 80s. So to appreciate Freud's influence, it's helpful if we can think about what the world was like when he was a physician. It was during the Victorian era in Europe when people were pretty puritanical. For example, women could not go out in public without having their entire body covered from their neck to their ankle. If you know anything about Freud already, you know that he did talk about sexuality a fair amount in his theory, and this did more than raise eyebrows. It was radical to talk about these ideas at the time, and many of them were not well received. His theory, I believe, has been misunderstood a lot over the years, and some of the criticisms that he's received have not been deserved. But two of Freud's important contributions were his idea that we have an unconscious mind, and that things that happen in our lives when we are young influence how we turn out later on. There's no real disputing these two facts now, although some of the specific ways in which he believed these influences take place have been challenged. So let's talk a little bit about his ideas. First of all, if you recall, he had a notion about how our mind is structured and organized. And he divided our mind into three parts: id, ego, and superego. When we come into the world as infants, he believed we are all id, and the id part of our personality, governed by the pleasure principle, wants immediate gratification of desires. The ego eventually emerges, and it's the more rational, practical, problem-solving part of our personality that operates according to the reality principle. And eventually the superego emerges, and it is our conscience helps us to appreciate the difference between right and wrong. All three of these parts of the personality have varying degrees of unconscious and conscious existence within our mind, the id being all unconscious according to Freud, and the ego and superego partially conscious and partially unconscious. Freud also developed a theory of development called psychosexual development, in which he identified 5 different stages that you can read about more specifically in your reading. And during these 5 stages, he believed that, especially in the first 3 stages, which take us up through the first 5 years or so of life, that the influences during those stages have a significant formative effect on how our personality turns out. And this idea of Freud's that things that go on early in our lives influence how we turn out later on, like I've said before, is an important idea and one that has turned out to be true. But he probably overemphasized how specific events that he talked about in his theory would give rise to specific kinds of personalities later on in life, because now we realize that genetics and other factors, environmental factors, also influence how our personalities turn out. But his theory is a fascinating and intriguing one, and I look forward to your digging into it in your reading and giving some thought to his ideas. Erik Erikson also developed a stage theory. Now, in the case of Freud's theory, it has 5 stages in it, and his last stage ends in adolescence. But Erikson's theory, which contains 8 stages, encompasses the entire lifespan, from infancy all the way through to old age. And this is one of the aspects of Erikson's theory that is so appealing. Erikson believed that Freud perhaps overemphasized sexuality in his theory, and he emphasized more the nature of our relationships with one another, calling his theory a psychosocial theory of development. Erikson believed that in each of his stages that we experience what he called a crisis that we need to resolve in order to move on to the next stage in a healthy way and remain on a normal developmental trajectory. So I encourage you to dig into his theory. We will be spending time on his theory throughout our course, looking at each stage as it relates to a particular developmental stage as we talk about these developmental stages throughout the chapters of our textbook. Just to give you an example, he received a good bit of attention for his 5th stage, identity versus role confusion, or some people say identity versus identity confusion, that occurs during adolescence. He believed this was an important time in our lives when we develop a clear sense of who we are as a person in terms of our identity, and that we need to know ourselves well before we move on to the next stage, which he calls intimacy versus isolation in young adulthood, when many of us make decisions about marriage. He said we need to know ourselves well before we can figure out a person that we would want to spend, hopefully, the rest of our lives with. One interesting bit of historical information about Erikson is that he received psychoanalytic training from Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter. And Erikson was well known for his work with children as an analyst. And even though he did not actually have a formal degree in psychology or medicine, because of his brilliance and other training that he received when he immigrated to America, he was highly regarded in the Northeast in such institutions as Harvard University, and taught and did clinical work in that part of the country. The other theorist that I wanted to comment on is Piaget. Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist. Actually, he was trained as a biologist in zoology, but became interested in psychology. And he became interested in child development when he and his wife had 3 children. Because of his brilliance, just by observing his children growing up, he was able to develop sophisticated and very influential theory of cognitive development of children that has inspired thousands of research studies over the years. So 2 of Piaget's ideas that are discussed early in our book are his notions that children develop cognitively in large part through a process of what he called assimilation and accommodation that occur when a child is interacting with the physical world around them, and that cognitive development proceeds through 4 stages that you'll be learning about. And we're not going to get into those stages today. We'll be learning about them as we go along. And then when you dig into your reading, you'll have a chance to learn more about them. These 4 stages encompass development from birth through adolescence. So he also had this idea about what he called schemas. And a schema is an organized pattern of thought and behavior that helps us to adapt to the world around us. When we come into the world, we really don't have any schema, but through our interaction with the environment around us, we develop many through the process of assimilation and accommodation. Let's use an example. Let's say that a young child has a pet dog at home, and he has a schema for dogs that is limited to his dog. The size of his dog, the kind of fur his dog has, what his dog looks like. So when he encounters another animal, he would try to assimilate or incorporate that animal into his existing schema. And if it fits, fine, great. And he'll call that new animal a dog too, and it'll be a good fit. But what if he encounters a cat and he's never seen a cat before? He'll appreciate that a cat is in some ways similar to a dog, but in some ways it's different. And now he's going to need to change his schema to incorporate this new animal. And when he does that, he is using a process that Piaget called accommodation. So in assimilation, we're able to incorporate some new experience into an existing scheme. But in accommodation, the new experience is different enough that we need to change an existing scheme or create a new scheme for that new experience. So children are going through this process of assimilation and accommodation many times every day as they're expanding the schema in their minds to better appreciate the world around them. Piaget focused mainly on how the child interacts with the physical world, not so much their social environment. Later on, we'll be learning about another theory, that of Lev Vygotsky, a Russian theorist, who emphasized social interaction and how children develop cognitively. Well, that's all for now. Thank you, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.